Welcome to the panel discussion on the Trust Alliance and how our collaborative approach uses technology to address known risks and to leverage shared opportunities. My name's Louise Gray and I have the privilege of chairing the Trust Alliance as well as being the Chief Operating Officer of Care Australia. During this session, you'll be able to ask questions and provide feedback via the platform with an opportunity for discussion at the end. I'm also happy for you to contact me separately after this event if you have any questions about the Trust Alliance and today's discussions. Before we start, I'd like to provide some context by sharing with you some of the history and the purpose of the Trust Alliance. The Trust Alliance is a cross-sector collaboration of organisations across international and domestic not-for-profit, humanitarian, research and technology organisations, all with a mission to lead the emergence of a useful and ethical digital identity ecosystem. Our focus is strongly on collaboration and collective action to maximise positive outcomes for the people in the communities that we exist to serve. The Trust Alliance provides members with a forum to identify and enable identity use cases and to advocate for the uptake of decentralised identity standards. Built on humanitarian foundations, the Trust Alliance puts people at the centre and in control of their own identities. Enabled by distributed technologies, an individual can access a credential from one Trust Alliance member and share it with another without relying on an intermediary, knowing that their personal information remains safe and secure. For organisations, this reduces duplication in training and compliance, it supports timely recruitment and engagement, and it minimises the risk of inappropriate employment. The benefit of digital identity and credential management came to the fore following highly publicised sexual misconduct cases in the aid sector. This raised the questions: how do we prevent predators being recycled through employment by different organisations in the sector? How do we support the need to deploy staff quickly in emergencies without placing at risk the very people we're trying to help? But digital credentials don't only address risk, they also provide efficiency, consistency, and they resolve concerns about privacy and data protection. The scope for wider application of the initiatives being developed and piloted by the Trust Alliance is significant, and it is through breadth and scale that we can build our innovation ecosystem, collaborate across sectors, ensure vulnerable people and communities have voices and agency, and above all, do no harm. Our panel will aim to provide a foundational understanding of the credentialing future state and why decentralised verifiable credentials are such a valuable opportunity for the sector. They'll share insights from their own perspectives as members of the Trust Alliance and representing the roles and organisations across the sectors, and I'm so pleased to introduce them to you tonight. We have three panellists to speak with. Our first panellist is Nick Byrne, the Director of Type Human, who has played a pivotal role in driving the technology to support our efforts. Our second panellist is Ellie Rennie, Professor and Future Fellow at RMIT University, who's provided foundational support in our research and insight space. And our third panellist is Anthony Spinks, Programs Director at Oxfam Australia, who brings a critical perspective as to how the Trust Alliance and our projects can be applied in practice. Our first speaker will be Nick, and I'll hand over to Nick now. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Louise. Really nice to be here with you all this evening or afternoon, morning, wherever you might be joining us from. I'm going to kick off my talk by just giving a bit of an overview of the technology and some background around the technology, and then I'll hand over to my other colleagues to go deeper into it. We often get a lot of questions about blockchain and what is a blockchain always comes up, so we're hoping to address those up front. But before we jump straight into the technology, I'm going to zoom out and talk about what is the problem that we're facing at the moment, what's the general solution to that, and then I'll reintroduce blockchain and technology as one of the solutions, as a tool to meet one of those solutions. So the problem in its core is that the digital economy now has grown from a humble beginning consisting of pseudonymous message boards to now being a ubiquitous e-commerce environment. We now use digital tools to access government. It's no longer a simple message board from where it began. So as the digital economy has expanded, it's began to expose three things. First of all, it's begun to expose some monopolistic practices, which is really limiting innovation and access to services. So an example of this is that there's over 1 billion people globally without formal identification. And we've got very little innovation happening in that space to address that problem, which you could argue that is because of the monopoly that governments have historically held in that space. The second thing we're seeing happening as the digital economy expands is that we're seeing more trusted data being exchanged online about people and things. So this is shifting away from the original pseudonymous internet message board and blending with the real world. And as these two worlds blend, we're needing more and more trusted data to enter into the digital economy. And so without a standard approach to doing this, it becomes a very costly exercise. Another example of this is where if you have to verify your legal identity online today, outside of passports, we don't have a globally consistent approach to doing this. And so instead we have a whole bunch of fragmented small tools that kind of butcher solutions together to help people verify identity online. So very costly. And then finally, as the digital economy becomes more ubiquitous and important to people's lives, we start to worry about things that could go wrong. So from cyber attacks through to manipulation by online advertising, we need to start to reach a consensus on what a safe digital economy looks like and how we can build one consistently across the world. So 3 questions that from a technology standpoint, we have really thought about moving through the digital identity problem is, first of all, in summary, is an innovation problem. So how does the digital economy continue to support and drive innovation so that everyone across the globe can benefit from this new global digitally connected economy? Second is around cost. So how do we continue to drive down the costs to integrate the pseudonymous internet with the real world? And in doing so, bring more businesses and people into the digital economy. And then thirdly, safety. So what is safety in the digital economy and how can we design and build for it going forward? So that's the broad problem space that as a technologist, we approach this problem from. And the solution is really digital standards as far as, again, a technologist and engineer looks at the world from. So from an innovation standpoint, if we can set and agree on some digital standards, we free up people to stop reinventing the wheel, and we can then turn their attention towards solving some more difficult, unsolved problems rather than just, again, reinventing the wheel. In doing that, we also start to loosen up the hold that some monopolistic businesses have in the digital economy and shift them towards more open ecosystems. So an open ecosystem built on standards provides a much stronger foundation for innovation and problem solving to occur from. Second, costs. We drive down costs by adopting digital standards because, again, people don't have to reinvent the wheel. So we free up money to be spent on other things. And then safety, by definition, if we start focusing in on standards that underpin the digital economy, we can start to discuss what social welfare outcomes we expect to see, and safety and design becomes central to that conversation. So now we introduce blockchain. Blockchain is the solution to the digital standards problem. We need digital standards to solve for the problems I've just outlined. And blockchain did arrive at a point in time where the digital economy was searching for a standard approach to finance, or more specifically, how we send value to others on the internet. It emerged infamously through Bitcoin as a standard for how we record and send value to anyone, anywhere in the world. And it did this in a decentralized way, meaning it's open, borderless, neutral, censorship resistant, immutable, and permissionless. So anybody can participate in the Bitcoin network. But beyond Bitcoin, blockchain technology is now being applied to other problems where we think standards can play a central role in driving innovation, reducing costs, and increasing digital safety. One application of this is in the digital credentials and identity, which is where the Trust Alliance is focusing heavily. And by applying a standards-based approach to credentials and identity within the humanitarian sector, we're really confident that we can start to drive innovation outcomes, for example, through scenarios like aid worker registration schemes and safeguarding communities. We can reduce administrative costs by making it easier for humanitarian organizations to build and operate their IT systems, and hopefully meet our general responsibilities to protect the communities that we serve. So that's where I'm going to pause. There's always more questions around what is blockchain and things like that I'm going to leave for the Q&A section. But the message I really wanted to send here is that we're really talking about digital standards and coordination, and blockchain has come at a time where we need that to help bring in the next wave of people into the digital economy. And my colleagues now will expand on that and talk a little bit more in detail about the Trust Alliance.
Thanks very much, Nick. I'll now hand over to Ellie.
Thanks, Louise. So Nick has described the technical, I suppose, dimensions of what we're talking about. I want to move into, I suppose, more of the people-centered coordination. And my main point is that what we're using here is really a technology of cooperation. What's interesting about verifiable credentials at one level is that it is about the user being in control, and it is a privacy-preserving technology. Essentially, with this particular platform that we're using at the moment, one called Traverse, but it could be any number of different applications. When an organisation issues a credential, it is issued to the person who earned that credential, and then they get to choose who they share it with. And it's actually built in the app at the time. It's not shared between organisations. So that's a key concept, I think, that we need to understand before I go further. But when I'm thinking about this technology, for me, it's really around what happens when we put it into practice, what capabilities occur because we have this technology. There's a longer version of what I'm about to say on the Trust Alliance website, if you're interested. But essentially, I want to outline three main critiques around technology and humanitarian work, and then circle back to why I think what the Trust Alliance is doing is different to these. So Jacobson has written that there's a temptation to see technology as neutral within the humanitarian sector. And neutrality is a principle, of course, that should be upheld and that organisations strive for, whether it's actually achievable or not. But technology, of course, is not neutral. There are design decisions that go into its creation. In my own work, I've seen this working with Indigenous communities, for instance, where so-called personal devices, which are made, under the assumption of individual use, are the subject of demand sharing and reciprocity. So someone can demand that use of another person. So those design assumptions fall apart pretty quickly, which can lead to issues around privacy and cyber safety for the users. But of course, in the humanitarian sector, some of the critical issues are around security as well. So where even when these technologies are used as intended, it can produce problematic outcomes for people, particularly because these honeypots of data can be hacked. And we're talking about scenarios where humanitarian organisations might be working without that much digital information on people and having to create it. And if that information falls into the wrong hands, it can lead to persecution. And a final critique that I think applies to what we're doing, or is interesting to consider in relation to what we're doing, is that technology can be a way to remove people from the field, that it, for instance, creates efficiencies that might mean that organisations feel they don't need as many people in place. And those efficiencies might also be related to eliminating risks for organisations, legal risks. But of course, people can do things that technologies can't. They can take into account context and they can consider someone's needs in that moment. And I think it's really important that we differentiate when we're talking about AIs and automated decision-making technologies, that there is a difference between something that is essentially an intelligent infrastructure, which is, I suppose, enabling a speed or scope in work that is not possible through manual work alone, and artificial intelligence, which is making judgments, or where there might be issues around values and context in regard to that. So, of course, humans matter, people matter, and having people at the coalface when crisis hits is really important. So why is the Trust Alliance approach a bit different to this, or why are we interested in it as researchers? Of course, the privacy preserving aspects are important and they matter in terms of humanitarian principles. So this, as I said before at the start, it's not an information sharing technology in the typical sense. It's not going to be an issue for that individual in terms of how their data might be on-sold or the kinds of problems that Nick has already outlined. I think also this is about, when we're talking about the verifiable credentials aspect of this technology, it's really about verification and eliminating the need for trust in many respects. So in many instances, this is going to be a straightforward process where someone has been issued with a credential and they're able to show it, and that receiving organisation can trust that credential because there is a record on the blockchain, and blockchains have immutable properties, which is when we start to probably get too technical. But effectively, because the ledger is shared among many distributed nodes, it can't be changed. It's censorship proof in that respect. So that organisation can really just look at that attestation, see that that is correct, and move on. In instances where that might have been revoked or expired, that credential, our hypothesis is that the organisation will be then able to go and do the manual work, spend the time, and hopefully have more time for those hard cases. So, of course, this needs to be tested, but we're hoping that really what the Trust Alliance does is create more time for organisations to be there in person when they need to be, or to look in depth at the things that need to be examined. And I think finally, a really important thing about what's occurring here is that the Trust Alliance, the organisation, so here I'm not talking about the verifiable credentials technology, but the network of organisations that is the Trust Alliance, is that the work that they are doing is agreeing on standards. And by that, I don't mean the technical standards, but things such as competencies, values, and behaviours that organisations in general have agreed on and are seeking to uphold within the sector. So some of this, of course, is already codified through bureaucratic processes, through peak bodies and the like, international agreements. But this is just making it easier to enact those already agreed upon things, and perhaps to find out where there might be other areas of agreement that are already accepted. And Anthea is going to talk more about what that means, for instance, with local organisations. So in the misconduct example that Louise already raised, a verifiable credential means that someone might be able to move from one organisation to another in an efficient and fast manner during an emergency response, and for the organisation that they have commenced their employment with to know that they have not committed misconduct in their former workplace. And that is quite a good example because it's not training. A code of conduct is something else. And so what we're looking at here and where it starts to become interesting is that these new technologies may be opening up ways of coordination that haven't existed before for us to identify what's agreed and the practices and standards that groups of organizations are seeking to implement. So that's what when I say this is a technology of cooperation, that's what we in the Research and Insights group are looking at right now and trying to understand what forms of cooperation are emerging. So I think what will be really interesting, and I'll just close here, is what it means when the humanitarian sector actually gets to define and operationalize what it wants to see in the world. And this is a small step towards that.
Thanks, Ellie. Anthea, can I hand over to you as our final panellist?
Great. Thanks, Louise, Nick and Ellie. And buenos dias, bonsoir, assalamu alaikum, and to all our wonderful colleagues that are joining us right across the world in many different time zones and on many different lands and in many different languages. It's really exciting to be part of this panel. before I talk a little bit about Oxfam's role in the Trust Alliance, also just acknowledging that this conference has been a long time coming for the Centre of Humanitarian Leadership. And it's just so brilliant that we're actually taking advantage of being able to do everything virtually now, because it does mean it is truly a global conference. And some of the sessions I've been in have really demonstrated just the ability that we wouldn't have had if this was a physical conference, to bring so many different people together under so many different topics. So it's really exciting to be part of this 2-day event. So as you've heard from Louise, Nick and Ellie, the Trust Alliance formed originally as a group of organisations that came together to try and tackle and grapple with some of these big, wicked problems or questions that Nick's spoken a little bit about. And as we've gone through that journey together, we've been doing more than just talking about things and putting our collaboration model together. We've been using the pilots and the projects that we've developed so far, and this credentialed pilot is the most advanced of those, to in real time put our collaboration model together and to test what does it mean when you actually bring a group of international organisations, a group of domestic Australian organisations, because we do have a number of Australian domestic organisations in our alliance, together with academia, and we've got a number of different academic institutions as part of our group, together with our tech partners such as Type Human. So to me, it's really a fascinating organisation, and we use the term organisation quite loosely at the moment because we are an alliance. And I think the reason I'm starting there is because it's really, for Oxfam and the journey that we've been on in the last 18 months with the Trust Alliance, has been about that alliance collaboration around the trust and around the tangible activities that we've been doing in the pilots that we're talking a little bit more deeply about today. So Oxfam was a founding member of the Trust Alliance, and we've also participated in a number of the projects that have led us to this point now of being able to test this portable credential using the product of Traverse. And so we've had a number of staff over that period of time that have been the guinea pigs, I guess, in terms of testing out the platform and the products. And we're really looking forward as an organisation to being part of taking it to the next level of opportunity and potential. So I think for us, one of the things that has been so obvious in terms of the value that this collaboration has brought for us is that it has opened the possibilities for use of these technologies in ways that I don't think single organisations, and potentially even just those, a very internal view of the sector, would have enabled. So if we hadn't brought together these very different stakeholders with very different perspectives, very different skills, and very different frameworks for operating, I don't think we would have progressed as quickly as we have. And it might feel like it's not been so quick over the last 18 months, but actually what we've managed to do as an alliance in that time, I think, is quite phenomenal in terms of getting an idea, getting a group of people together around a table, formulating some very deep pilots, getting them tested, having staff who have been willing to be with us on that journey, now to the point where we're actually able to be here talking to this conference about the excitement that we all have about the potential for this use of the technology. And what that means, I think, for the sector is really important, because we've got a number of different sort of cases or test cases that we're looking at the credentials around misconduct, looking at the credentials around training. That's just the tip of what the potential is for us to use this within our sector. The pilots that we've been looking at, I think, are really important, not only from a learning now perspective, but also because one of the things that I'm really excited about is, well, what does it mean if we're talking about the portability of a credential between members of the Trust Alliance? What does that look like if we take that into a much bigger context? And let's think of a lot of our networks are the same networks. As the international humanitarian sector and system, a lot of staff are working across a lot of different organisations, But all those organisations are often working within some of the similar frameworks. So we might have similar requirements that we put on ourselves in terms of our standards, but we might have similar requirements that are part of just being in the system, in terms of part of it, making sure that we have systems and processes and practices in place to meet various different requirements of our donor community. For example, we might have people that have brought with them experience and expertise that we are not necessarily fully tapping into. And so how are we using these kinds of technologies to be able to not only take very tangible credentials as they currently sit. So I might have done a training on mental health first aid, and I might have done that with an organisation 6 months ago. I turn up, I get a new job. I can show, demonstrate, and very clearly that is my credential. It's mine to choose to show. And I can very quickly and easily show that to a new prospective employer. And that helps demonstrate that actually I come already with some competencies. I come already with various different qualifications. I come already to you with something that is going to be similar to the needs of my previous organisation and potentially to the needs of a future organisation. So I see that the potential for that is really, really exciting. The other thing that I think is a very clear principle for us as an alliance is that it is around sovereign identity. The user is in control, and that's why the pilots that we've been working with, and that's where the role that some of our members play, such as the work that Ellie's leading on our research and insights, is really critical, that we're testing this with users. So we're wanting to make sure that actually what we're designing is with the user in control of that. What we need to do in future iterations of that is to trial that user experience in a whole range of different contexts and make sure that that's equally as applicable. But what it means for me as a user is that I can therefore decide how much of this information is being shared or am I taking across. And I think that's really important as well from a principle of self-determination, from a principle of humanity first, from a principle of dignity of your own decisions. And so that's where I see for us as the humanitarian sector, these kinds of collaborations and taking these kinds of technologies with us as we evolve as a sector is really critical. The theme for this conference is, new humanitarianism and what does that actually look like? And a number of the sessions I was on in yesterday's panel were really trying to push the boundaries of, well, who are the humanitarians now and in the future? What is the whole system looking like now and in the future? And how do we begin to shape that, not just by ourselves? And I think there were a couple of conversations I was in yesterday where it was really clear that you can't reform without you can't reform yourself completely just from the inside out. So the reform of the system needs to be done in collaboration with some of our potentially more common partners, but not necessarily all our common partners. And that's what I think is also the real benefit of being in something like the Trust Alliance. And that's certainly what Oxfam has seen as that real benefit and that real approach to collaboration and the integrating of a test and learn and an insights piece into everything that we do, because that is where we will actually see the potential and that is where we will actually see the scale. Nick earlier talked about some of the opportunities that things like this technology can bring, and I think one of them is really around the efficiencies. So we all know that we're often in very resource-constrained environments. If there are small ways that we can actually make our systems, and by that I mean our organisational systems, not the humanitarian system writ large, or that'd be delightful as well if we could, but if we can make our systems more efficient and more applicable to the user, then that's where I also see that there's massive potential. The other thing that I think is really fascinating about the work of the Trust Alliance and about some of the pilots and the projects that we've done so far is that it speaks to this question of technology cooperation that Ellie referenced, and it also speaks to some of the topics that I've been hearing in other conversations throughout yesterday, but also much more broadly when we talk about innovation in our sector. That innovation is critical for us as we evolve and move forward, but we can't see it as something that sits outside the utility of its application, and we can't see it as something that is kind of brought in to test out. We have to see that hand in hand with the impacts that we want to have. We have to see that hand in hand with the reality of the kinds of contexts in which we're working. And we have to see it as something that is not just noise for our organisations and for our operations, but actually something that is designed to make our lives and the lives of the communities that we're working with actually better. And that's where I do see that the work that we're doing with the Trust Alliance and these initial pilots is really, that is the focus. Humanity first is our guiding sort of motto. I don't think we've been in a single Trust Alliance meeting where we don't use that and make sure that that's front and centre of why the organisations are around the table and why we're doing the kind of work that we are doing. There's a couple of other examples that I think that we could look at in terms of what's the potential for the use of this. There are lots of conversations at the moment about vaccinations and where's the portability of your vaccination proof. So I think there's just the beginning of lots of opportunities that will be so important for our sector that possibly are ideas that we haven't even thought of. And what I really hope is that as we get into the conversation and the Q&A with you guys, that you might be sparking ideas for us that are new and even more exciting opportunities that we can build forward. The last opportunity that I think I'll leave with in terms of what I see as some of the potential for this is, at the moment, it's an example of a different use of blockchain technology that Oxfam is working on, and we have quite a number of projects around the world at the moment where we are doing cash programming utilising blockchain technology. The largest example of that is the work that we're currently doing in the Pacific region, actually. And that project at the moment is the cash component of that project is distributed through the blockchain, but the recipients of that are still getting cards, and they're still having to register, and they're still having to turn up with their identity documents that Nick referenced, in terms of there are so many millions of people across the globe who don't have those. So one of the potentials that I think you could look at is actually bringing all of that together, so that not only is your identity on the blockchain, but your access to the cash component, which is the programming element that we're doing, is also there. And it actually brings together the two components of our programming work and our identity work. And to me, that's, it's probably a long way away. So we're probably not going to get there by Christmas. But to me, that is actually the beauty of the work that we're doing in the Trust Alliance, that we're not seeing this piece of work around portability of credentials, around self-sovereign identity. We're not seeing that in isolation of actually the reality of how it can actually link with the operational work that we're doing as an organisation as well. So I'm really looking forward to the questions that we can discuss together and to see where this goes. So thank you.
Thanks, Anthea. And I think you all spoke about the concepts that lead to impact. So we've talked about employment credentials, we've talked about program delivery, but all of these relate to impact. And I think that's the fundamental goal of the Trust Alliance, is the use of digital technology to support the impact. So the reason that we actually exist as organisations. And I think those concepts of portability, of timeliness, of trust, all lend themselves to technology solutions. So thank you everyone